So today I'm going to be discussing psychological distress among family members and whether one member's psychological distress impacts the other member. As we know, there's a high prevalence of mental disorders in youth and the persistence of these disorders into adulthood. Notably, mental health diagnoses in youth are significantly underreported, but despite this, the high prevalence suggests it's essential to examine the environmental contributors to the development and the maintenance of these disorders. There have been many factors identified as possible contributors to child psychopathology, and the present study focuses on parental psychological distress, so depression, anxiety, and anger, as contributors to the development and maintenance of internalizing problems in youth. Parental psychological distress has been associated with an increased likelihood of child mental health problems, and previous research emphasized maternal or paternal psychological distress separately as predisposing factors for emotional and behavioral problems in youth. While both of these seem to impact child internalizing issues, the interaction of paternal and maternal psychological distress likely affects the child but has been understudied. And while couples have been studied extensively, the effect of one parent's distress on another is a relatively new area of interest that warrants further exploration. I say that this is understudied because much of the research related to parenting is associated with a marital relationship or romantic relationship component. It's important to note that you can be a parent without being in a romantic relationship or being married, and I think this needs to be emphasized further within the literature. In general, though, father and mother psychopathology symptoms are found to be positively correlated, and the parenting relationship is also considered to be one of interdependence and reciprocity. So whatever impacts one parent will influence the other, and this can be termed emotional connection. I briefly wanted to review this study. It's an older study that's talking about spillover effect, and spillover takes place when there is a direct transfer of mood, affect, or behavior from one setting to another. Researchers have expanded this definition to include not only settings, but also relationships. So this is perhaps best illustrated through the examination of spillover of tension from one person to another within a dyad. So from this perspective, tensions in a particular family subsystem are stressors that lead to additional problems in other family subsystems. So previous research with the spillover effect emphasized a spillover process that flowed from parent to child. However, it's important to note that the other direction of spillover is also possible, because children are no longer seen as passive recipients of family influences. Rather, children are now recognized as active contributors to the family environment. The results from this study suggest overwhelming support of the spillover effect from marital dyad to the parent-child dyad. And this result supports the expectation that, like spillover of mood, affect, and behavior from one setting to another, it can also spill over from one familial relationship to another. So given this previous research, we hypothesized that parental psychological distress would influence child internalizing behavior, and parental psychological distress would also influence the other parent's psychological distress. We also thought that child internalizing would impact parental psychological distress. So the previous predominant method of studying the parent-child dyad was through a unidirectional model, and this model implied that parents had a greater influence over the relationship. There is now more recent emphasis on the reciprocal transaction between parent and child, and we wanted our study to also convey this reciprocal transaction. So the present study used archival data from the National Institute of Child and Human Development Study of Early Child Care and Youth Development, and that was 1,300 families from birth to 15. The measures were assessed from grades 1 through 9, so the approximate ages of the children were 6 through 15, and child internalizing behavior was measured through the child behavior checklist, so both mother and father report. Parental depression was measured through the Center for Epidemiological Studies Depression Scale, or the CESD. Parental anger was measured through the State Trait Anger Scale, and parental anxiety was measured through the State Trait Anxiety Inventory. Jack McCardle and Aki Hamagami introduced latent difference score modeling, and this analysis allowed each person in a dyad to affect the other's change. In the present study, we're going to adapt it to 3 people, so we're building a trivariate latent difference score model in comparison to the traditional bivariate model. So on this slide, I'm going to zoom into the model to explain it a little bit better. If we look here, the square, child int 1, is a manifest or observed variable. So we break this variable into two components, the associated error, which is below, and the pure measure of the construct. The interesting part of this is we can create a pure change variable by looking at how one latent variable impacts the other over time. So you see the change in child internalizing up here, and we can look at the actual change between time points within this model. So this model has a lot going on, so I shifted it slightly so that I can break it down to better show how one person impacts the other over time. This is the most important part of the model as we're looking at the cross lags across time. So we're seeing how the level or the amount of child internalizing behavior at time 1 is impacting change in father depression, as well as the reciprocal relationship. So we can look at the father depression latent change variable, which is up here, and look at it from time 1 to time 3 and see that it can be predicted by the child internalizing, the level of it, or the amount of child internalizing at time 1. So if father or child were to change, the model demonstrates how the amount of the variable at the previous time point in the other individual, so for example, the amount of child internalizing behavior at time 1 impacts that change. So impacts the change from time 1 to time 3 in father depression. In this, I'm not showing all the time points or influences across family members because the figure becomes too complex. But just so you know, we're looking at each of these time points with each family member and how that impacts the others over time. So these are all the models that were run. But for clarity purposes, we kept mother anxiety and child internalizing behavior consistent, but we varied the psychological distress that the father presented with. So in our first model, we looked at father anger, mother anxiety, and child internalizing behavior. And we can see that father anger at time 1 predicted change in mother anxiety from time 1 to time 3. And it predicted change in child internalizing from time 1 to time 3. Mother anxiety at time 1 predicted change in father anger from time 1 to time 3. And it predicted change in child internalizing from time 1 to time 3. However, child internalizing did not predict change in the father's anger or the mother's anxiety. So we can see that there's a bidirectional relationship between father anger and mother anxiety, and that it appears parents influence change in the child more than the child impacts the parents in this case. In this model, we're looking at father depression, mother anxiety, and child internalizing. And this is not as significant of a model, but what we do find is that father depression at time 1 predicts change in mother anxiety from time 1 to time 3, but didn't predict change in child internalizing behaviors. Mother anxiety didn't predict change in father depression or child internalizing, and child internalizing did not predict change in mother anxiety or father depression. So the takeaway from this slide is that father depression predicts later change in mother anxiety. This is our most significant model, and we're looking at father anxiety, mother anxiety, and child internalizing. So father anxiety at time 1 predicts change in mother's anxiety from time 1 to time 3, and it predicts change in child internalizing from time 1 to time 3. Mother anxiety at time 1 predicts change in child internalizing from time 1 to time 3, but it does not predict change in father anxiety. Child internalizing at time 1 predicts change in father anxiety from time 1 to time 3, but does not predict mother's anxiety. So what does that all mean? It's clear that depending on the presenting psychological distress, each family member differentially impacts others within the family unit. So a systems-based approach is needed clinically and developmentally. Bowen examined and identified reciprocal processes through which psychopathology manifested within the family unit. Emotional interdependence between family members led to his assertion that functioning of one individual in a family unit can't be adequately understood without the context of the functioning of others in the immediate environment. So in applying this to psychopathology in general, it could be hypothesized that thoughts, behaviors, and feelings an individual exhibits are a reflection of what's occurring in their environment. So the takeaway is that given thoughts, behaviors, and feelings that a child or parent may present with are reflections of the immediate environment, it's essential to assess the psychological distress of each family member to determine whether one is impacting the other. Another takeaway I had from this particular study is that fathers are so important. Fathers pretty consistently influence both mother and child throughout the results, and this suggests that they may play a more prominent role and influence other members of the family member to a greater degree than was previously emphasized. So the inclusion of fathers in research and clinical settings would be beneficial. The last takeaway is that previous research really focused on dyads within a family subsystem, but advanced statistical techniques are now allowing us to examine more intricate family units simultaneously to get a more complete picture of functioning. So this is something that we could potentially use moving forward.